In honor of Jackie Robinson Day coming up later this week, I wanted to make a video about the top 10 pre-Negro League and Negro League players. Some of these guys you may have heard of, and some you may not have. Stick with me, and I'll tell you all about them. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me in my channel Brutus on Baseball. In this video, I'm going to cover the top 10 players, at least in my opinion, that played from the pre-Negro League era and the Negro League era. Now, some people don't know why I would say pre-Negro League and Negro League, and because of that, I want to put a little bit of context to this. African-American players were barred from playing in Major League Baseball around 1887. This is when a gentleman's agreement came into being that would segregate baseball for the next 60 years. There were a couple players like Moses Fleetwood Walker that played in the 1880s, but because a lot of white players at that time did not want to play with black players, the National League owners agreed to segregate baseball in 1887. So black players had no option to play in Major League Baseball. They had to form their own teams, their own leagues to be able to play the game that they loved. Now, the Negro Leagues, which is what we usually refer to black baseball prior to 1947, didn't actually begin until 1920. So everything before 1920 was very disorganized. There was no league per se. It was just a bunch of teams that would bring players together and travel around playing exhibition, barnstorming type games. There were some teams that had some staying power, but not a true league that consisted of the same teams over and over again. That didn't happen until 1920. Now, in 2020, Major League Baseball did recognize the Negro Leagues as being official Major League equivalents. And as a result, the stats from those Negro League teams and players have been recognized as true Major League stats. But there's still two major issues with this. First of all, for the pre-Negro Leagues, there still wasn't a lot of great record keeping. So the black players that played in the first 20 years of the 20th century have a lot of their stats, their averages, their records lost to time. So what we have is little snippets of information and a lot of stories to go from. The second problem is that even after the Negro Leagues began, the Negro League season was actually really short, sometimes 30, 40, 50 games in a season, because there wasn't a lot of teams to play. And so what these teams actually did is they would play a lot of exhibition games, quite often against professional white players from the major leagues. But these stats from exhibition games aren't counted in the record, at least not the Major League record. And so when we talk about record holders for the Negro Leagues, you're talking about a very small amount of games compared to what they actually played. There is still a wealth of information available out there to learn more about the Negro Leagues, and I encourage you on this Jackie Robinson Day to do that. After you watch this video, go learn a little bit more about this path that the African-American players had to go through in order to get to the point where Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. So before we get started, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Any of those things helps me a lot to keep this channel going. And with that, let's get to it. Now, this list is going to be my opinion of the top 10 players. There's a lot of different opinions out there. But where I'm going to start before I get into the top 10 is with one guy in particular, the guy that they call the father of black baseball, the one that made it all happen, Andrew Rube Foster. Now, Rube Foster was born in Texas in 1879. He began his pitching career playing for the Fort Worth Yellow Jackets in 1897. Now, as is the case with a lot of young black players from this time, he bounced around a lot to different teams. By 1902, though, he was discovered by the Chicago Giants. That season in 1902, he reportedly won 44 games in a row. And the following season, he topped that, winning 54 games against one loss. The origin of Rube Foster's nickname, Rube, came from an exhibition game around 1903, where he went up against Hall of Famer Rube Waddell from the Philadelphia Athletics, and he outpitched him. And from then on, people started calling him Rube, and it caught on, and he used it for the rest of his career. Now, Foster was a great pitcher, but in 1907, he jumped to the Chicago Leland Giants, and this is where his career really started to take a turn. He was named player manager of the Leland Giants, and under his leadership in 1907, the Giants went 110 wins against 10 losses. He continued pitching for the next few years, but by 1910, he had actually wrested control of the team away from the original owner, and he continued to put together one of the best teams of his career in 1910. That team in 1910 went 123 wins and 6 losses. In 1911, he entered into a partnership with John Shorling, the son-in-law of the White Sox owner Charles Comiskey. Shorling would lease the grounds of the former White Sox stadium to Foster, where he would move his new team, the team that he called the Chicago American Giants. Foster would be responsible for really instilling the aggressive yet disciplined style of play that the Negro Leagues would be well known for in the coming decades. But he had put a lot of importance, too, on a high standard for professionalism and conduct for his players. Throughout the 1910s, he built the Chicago American Giants into the premier black baseball team in the United States. But again, Foster had set his sights even higher. By 1919, he had helped to finance a new team in Detroit called the Detroit Stars. And in 1920, he gathered owners from 6 different other black baseball teams in the Midwest to form the Negro National League. Foster was named president and treasurer of the new league, while still owning the Chicago American Giants. The Negro National League was the first truly successful league formed for African American baseball players. Under Foster's leadership, the Negro National League became a thriving and successful organization and paved the way for other black baseball leagues to follow eventually. Now, over the years, Foster grew more and more paranoid as time went by. In 1926, his grueling schedule caused him to have a nervous breakdown, and he was institutionalized midway through the 1926 baseball season. He would pass away 4 years later in 1930. Foster was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1981 as a pioneer for black baseball. Now, I didn't put Rube Foster in my top 10, but I mention him because without him, who knows if I would have the stories of all of these other players that I'm about to tell you that were able to play in the organized Negro leagues of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Okay, so on to my list. I'm going to start with number 10 here, and that's James Thomas Cool Papa Bell. Now, Cool Papa Bell was born in Mississippi in 1903. At the age of 17, his family moved to St. Louis. He signed on with a semi-pro team in St. Louis first, and actually as a pitcher in the beginning of his career. And then he was picked up by the St. Louis Stars at the age of 19 in 1922, where he would play for the next 10 seasons. Now, Bell got his nickname Cool Papa from his manager with the St. Louis Stars when he was a young pitcher for the team. The story goes that he struck out Oscar Charleston, one of the best players in the Negro Leagues, and his manager started calling him Cool Papa after that. But he wouldn't stay on the mound for long. His defense and especially his speed became a thing of legends. He's often thought of as one of the fastest men to ever play the game. He often went from first to third on bunts, scored from second base on sacrifice flies, and there's even record of him stealing 2 bases on one single pitch on 3 different occasions. Though he wasn't a power hitter, Bell still could hold his own with the bat, hitting .325 with a 126 OPS plus over a 21-season career, all of these stats from the Negro League games themselves. Later in his career, he would join legendary teams, the Pittsburgh Crawfords in the mid-1930s, and then the Homestead Grays in the early 1940s. He also played in the Dominican League and the Mexican League in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And he even won the Triple Crown in the Mexican League in 1940, although 8 of his 12 home runs that year were of the inside-the-park variety. During an exhibition game on a very soggy day in Chicago, Cool Papa Bell was timed going all the way around the bases on an inside-the-park home run at 13.1 seconds. To put that in context, the Major League record that we have in place is D. Gordon doing it in 2015 in 13.95 seconds. Cool Papa Bell's final season would be in 1946 with the Homestead Grays at the age of 43, where he hit for a .400 batting average for the season and a 164 OPS plus. He then became manager for several Negro League minor league teams and even scouted for the St. Louis Browns from 1950 into 1953. Bell was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1974. The stories that everybody hears about Cool Papa Bell, like he could turn off a light and be in bed before the light actually goes out. But one of my favorite quotes is from Satchel Page. Page said of Cool Papa Bell, "One time he hit a line drive right past my ear. I turned around and I saw the ball hit him sliding into second." Number 9 on my list is Monte Irvin. Monte Irvin was born in Alabama in 1919. Growing up, he was a 4-sport star, and he excelled in football especially, but eventually he chose baseball. He was recruited by the Newark Eagles in 1938, where he started playing. Monte Irvin had the nickname Mr. Murder, and it doesn't take much imagination to figure out why that might be. He could hit for both average and power and provide excellent defense. Irvin had incredible seasons for both 1940 and 41 for the Eagles team, leading the league in batting average both of those years. After these great seasons, he promptly asked for a raise. And when he didn't get it from the Eagles, he left town and went and played for the Mexican League in 1942 and 1943, where he promptly won the Triple Crown. He then served a tour in the military for the 1944 and 1945 seasons. But then he returned to the Newark Eagles again in 1946 and he didn't miss a beat, leading the league again with a .369 batting average upon his return. Now, 1947 was the year that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, and it wasn't long after that the New York Giants picked up Monte Irvin's contract for the 1949 season. It was often said that Irvin was actually the leading candidate to be the first player to break the color barrier in baseball. The owner and manager of the New York Eagles really thought that he had the ability and the temperament to be able to do so, but for whatever reason, Branch Rickey went with Jackie Robinson instead. But it really didn't matter much. As soon as Irvin was inserted into the New York Giants lineup, he became a star there as well. He was the Giants' regular left fielder for 8 seasons, where he played alongside Willie Mays for most of those years and compiled a .127 OPS plus in the major leagues. Following his playing career, Irvin became a scout for the New York Mets and later spent 17 years as a public relations specialist in the commissioner's office under Bowie Kuhn. One of my favorite quotes about Monte Irvin is from his longtime Giants teammate Willie Mays. Mays said Monte Irvin was one of the greatest ball players of his time, but he was also a great ambassador for the game. Number 8 on my list is George Mule Suttles. Mule Suttles was born in Alabama in 1901. He got his nickname because of his brute strength and just how far that he was able to hit the ball. But despite all this, he was known as one of the gentlest souls, and he was seen as a father figure to a lot of the young baseball players that were coming up through the Negro Leagues. He had that very laid-back personality, and he was not boastful whatsoever of his talents. And because of that, a lot of people think he was overlooked for a long time. Now, Mule Suttles had a playing career that almost matched the Negro Leagues entirely, from 1921 to 1944. He started out with the Birmingham Black Barons, and then went on to play for the St. Louis Stars, the Chicago American Giants, and he finished his professional career playing for the Newark Eagles. In league play, he had a career .339 batting average with a 1.03 OPS, which was good for a 172 OPS plus against his peers. After retiring from baseball, Mule Suttles worked as a custodian for the Newark Public Library in New Jersey. He stayed involved in coaching youth baseball all the way up until his death in 1966. He was finally inducted into the Hall of Fame during the special election in 2006. One of my favorite quotes about Mule Suttles was from the legendary quote master, Buck O'Neil. O'Neil said, "Mule Suttles was a giant of a man with a heart to match. His prodigious power is what puts him at number 8 on the list of best Negro League players." Number 7 on my list of best players from the Negro Leagues is Smokey Joe Williams. Now, Joe Williams was born in 1886 in Texas, and he was half African American and half Native American. He began playing professional baseball in 1905 for the San Antonio Black Broncos, and he was an immediate star, posting a record of 115 wins and 31 losses over the next 5 seasons. Williams went on later in his career to pitch for more prominent teams, like the Cuban Stars, the Indianapolis ABCs, the Chicago American Giants, and the New York Lincoln Giants. There's a number of different stories about how Smokey Joe got his nickname, but the 2 most common ones are that it was a response to the constant haze that was surrounding him as he smoked cigars between every single inning. And the other story is about how fast he threw the ball, that when he threw it, you could see smoke trailing behind it. Either way, it's another great nickname. Because he spent most of his career before the start of the Negro Leagues, a lot of Smokey Joe's statistics are lost to time. But one of the stats that was recorded somewhere was in 1914, Smokey Joe Williams was credited with 41 wins against 3 losses. Now, what puts him way up this list, even though we don't have a lot of records, is how good he was in exhibition games, especially against white players. And his record was 20 wins and 7 losses in these games. He beat Hall of Famers, the likes of Walter Johnson, Grover Cleveland Alexander, Chief Bender, Rube Marquardt, and Waite Hoyt. In 1912, he pitched against the National League champion New York Giants and beat them 6-0. 3 years later, he played against the National League champ, the Philadelphia Phillies, and he beat Grover Cleveland Alexander 1-0, allowing only 3 hits for the entire game. And then in 1917, Smokey Joe pitched against the National League champ New York Giants again. This time he pitched a complete game no-hitter and struck out 20 batters, even though he'd lost the game 1-0 because of an error. By the time the Negro Leagues had formed, Smokey Joe Williams was already on the decline phase of his career. But he did play all the way up until 1929 when he pitched for the Homestead Grays. That year, he won 12 games and lost 7 at the age of 43 years old. Smokey Joe Williams would finally be elected to the Hall of Fame in 1999. One of the best quotes about Smokey Joe Williams was from the great Bambino himself, Babe Ruth. Ruth said he had the best curveball I ever saw. When he pitched, it was like throwing an aspirin tablet into a barrel. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but just because Babe Ruth said it, it sounds pretty cool. Next up is number 6 on my list, Norman Thomas Turkey Stearns. Norman Thomas Stearns was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1901. He got the nickname Turkey as a small child, actually, owing to his unusual running style, with his arms flapping about everywhere. And his home run trots later on would come to be known as turkey trots. He was a very quiet and very unassuming man, and his teammates often said that there's only 2 words that you could ever get Turkey to say: yes or no. That was it. Now, Turkey Stearns was a 5-tool player before that term was widely coined. He first signed with the semi-pro Nashville Giants in 1920 as a 19-year-old. But he had moved to the Detroit Stars by 1923, where he'd go on to play the next 6 seasons. After the Detroit Stars couldn't pay him in the middle of the Great Depression, though, he moved on to play for several different teams for the remainder of his career, most prominently the Chicago American Giants, and then finishing his career with the Kansas City Monarchs. Stearns was known for his prodigious power, leading the Negro League in home runs 7 different times in the 1920s. But he also hit for a high average, stole a ton of bases, and was well known for his great defense in center field. A true all-around player. In the official Negro League play, he finished his career with a .348 batting average and 1.032 OPS, which was good for a 177 OPS plus against his peers. He led the Negro Leagues in batting average twice, in triples 6 times, and in home runs 7 times. And he's credited with 187 home runs in Negro League play, which, as a reminder, have very shortened seasons. And that number is good for first all-time among all Negro League players. And although records of all those exhibition games are very sketchy, he's often put into the top 3 of all-time home runs hit by Negro League players. Now, Turkey Stearns had to work in Detroit's automotive industry in all of his downtime to be able to make ends meet, which he also continued after he retired in 1940. He also spent years in Detroit coaching young children how to develop their baseball skills. It took a long time, but he was finally elected into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2000. One of my favorite quotes about Turkey Stearns is again by Buck O'Neil. O'Neil said, "Turkey Stearns was one of the greatest players to ever play the game. His speed, arm, and powerful bat made him a complete player in every sense." That's why I put him so high, because in my mind, he was a true 5-tool star. And that's not something that a lot of players can say, that they were good at every single facet of the game. Number 5 on my list is Walter Buck Leonard. Walter Leonard was born in North Carolina in 1907. When he was young, his parents usually called him Buddy. But he had a younger brother that couldn't pronounce Buddy, and so he started calling him Bucky. Everybody started calling him Buck, and the name stuck for the rest of his life. Now, Buck Leonard's father passed away when he was 11 years old, and as a result, he started his life of working at that age. And because of that, he would actually work for a number of years before losing his job and putting everything he had into playing baseball for a living at the age of 26. He played for semi-pro teams in North Carolina before then, but hadn't really taken it seriously until he joined the Brooklyn Royal Giants in 1933. And then he quickly moved to the legendary team, the Homestead Grays, in 1934, the team he played with until retirement in 1950. The first baseman spent 15 years with the Grays, the longest tenure of any Negro League player with one Negro League team in history. He played in a record 11 East versus West All-Star games for the Negro Leagues as well. The Grays of the late 30s and early 40s were considered one of the best teams assembled in any league. They won 9 league pennants in the stretch of time that Buck Leonard played for them. Leonard batted 4th in the Grays lineup behind the great Josh Gibson. Year after year, he either led the league in home runs or placed second behind Gibson. Since Gibson was often called the Black Babe Ruth, it was inevitable that Buck Leonard would be called the Black Lou Gehrig. In official Negro League play, Leonard had a .346 career batting average and 1.046 OPS, which was good for a 180 OPS plus against his peers. After his playing career ended, he was actually vice president of several different farm teams near his hometown of Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Buck Leonard was inducted to the Hall of Fame in 1972, right alongside his teammate Josh Gibson and one of the first handful of Negro League players put into the Hall of Fame. One of my favorite quotes about Buck Leonard that really sums up his greatness was from Monty Irvin himself. Irvin said that if Leonard had been allowed to play in the major leagues, baseball fans might have called Lou Gehrig the White Buck Leonard. He was that good. Number 4 on the list is John Henry Pop Lloyd. John Henry Lloyd was one of the earliest black baseball players to play in the pre-Negro leagues. He was the descendant of slaves, and he was born in Florida in 1884. He started his professional career in 1905, and he played almost his entire career before the advent of the Negro Leagues, so most of his statistics and records are completely lost to time. Even though not much is known about his statistics, the stories of his play became legend, as he was known as one of the best baseball players of that time period. He earned the nickname Pop because he was so mild-mannered with very few bad habits, and he approached the game as a gentleman. And because of that, the young players coming up through the Negro Leagues saw him as a father figure and started calling him Pop. Now, Lloyd was still around and playing by the time the Negro League started, and in about a decade of playing in the Negro Leagues at the end of his career, he still managed to compile a batting average of almost .350. Even in 1929, at the age of 45 in the Negro Leagues, he batted .365 with a 150 OPS plus. Pop Lloyd was known for his versatility on the field as well, playing third base, shortstop, outfield, wherever he was needed. He was one of the best players of his era, and he was often compared to contemporary Honus Wagner, both for his fielding and hitting abilities. He was also well respected for his leadership as both a player and a manager for many years. And the story goes that he was able to hit all the way up until the time he stopped playing, in his late 50s. Later in life, Lloyd became a janitor for the Atlantic City school system, and even though he didn't have kids of his own, he was a very popular coach in the youth baseball scene in Atlantic City. He was eventually elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1977. Now, quotes about Pop Lloyd. Well, you can't go wrong with Babe Ruth saying that Pop Lloyd was the best baseball player he ever saw. But perhaps even better than that, Pop Lloyd was constantly called the Black Wagner in reference to Honus Wagner throughout his playing career. A famous quote from Honus Wagner himself, he said of Pop Lloyd, "It's an honor to be compared to him." Number 3 on my list is Leroy Satchel Page. Leroy Page was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1906, although he didn't actually know his true date of birth until his birth certificate was tracked down by the owner of the Cleveland Indians before signing him to a contract in Major League Baseball in 1948. Now, Page began his playing career at the Alabama Reform School for Juvenile Negro Lawbreakers, after he was sentenced to 6 years there at the age of 12. His sentence is said to be a result of truancy from school, as well as his tendency to grab things that didn't necessarily belong to him. He learned how to pitch at the reform school, and he often said he traded 5 years of freedom to learn how to pitch. And because of that, they were not wasted years at all. Now, Satchel Page bounced around a lot in his career looking for the next paycheck. Because of this, he played all over the United States, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, both in professional leagues and barnstorming style. It's difficult to say how many wins he actually accumulated through his career. In his time in the Negro Leagues and Major League Baseball, he's credited with 124 wins, a 2.73 ERA, and a 150 ERA plus. But if you count all the leagues, all the exhibition games he played in, the number of wins that he had is estimated to be around 600 at the low end and up to 2,000 on the high end over the entire course of his career. That's quite a large range, and it's impossible to know exactly what it is. During his career, he played for many teams, but most prominently the Birmingham Black Barons, the Pittsburgh Crawfords in the 1930s, and the Kansas City Monarchs. After Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, Satchel Page became the oldest rookie in Major League history when he was signed by the Cleveland Indians for the 1948 season at the age of 42 years old. In that year, against Major League competition, he still went 6 wins and 1 loss, with 3 shutouts, a save, and a 2.48 ERA. He pitched 2 seasons for the Cleveland Indians, followed by 3 more for the St. Louis Browns, before retiring at the age of 46. But he even came back to sign a contract with the Kansas City Athletics in 1965 at the age of 58 years old. It was a bit of a gimmick, but even so, he did pitch in a Major League game that year, pitching 3 innings and striking out 1 while allowing 1 hit, no walks, and no runs, before retiring for good. Satchel Page was the first Negro League player inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1971. There are tons of quotes out there by a lot of different players that were able to face Satchel Page. Joe DiMaggio called him the best and fastest pitcher I've ever faced, a sentiment that was echoed by multiple Hall of Fame players like Bob Feller, Charlie Gehringer, Ted Williams, and Robin Roberts. Number 2 on the list is Josh Gibson. Gibson was born in Georgia in 1911, and for one reason or another, he doesn't really have a great nickname that stuck. It's too bad. He started playing organized baseball at the age of 16 in 1927, and by 1929 had joined the Crawford Colored Giants, a semi-pro team in Pittsburgh. But the story about how he became a professional baseball player is one for the ages. In July of 1930, he was sitting in the stands watching a Homestead Grays game when the starting catcher Buck Ewing injured his hand in the middle of the game. The Homestead Grays manager had heard things about Josh Gibson, and they recognized him in the stands. They asked him to come right down out of the stands and start playing for the team that day, and he never looked back. In 1933, the records show that he hit .467 with 55 home runs in 137 games against all levels of competition. Now, all those extra games outside of the official Negro Leagues really meant a lot for Josh Gibson's career. His Hall of Fame plaque states he hit almost 800 home runs in the league and independent baseball during his 17-year career. Based on the compilation of official data, his career batting average was .374, and he hit a .214 OPS+. He won 9 home run titles and 4 batting titles, playing for the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays. He's credited with hitting the most home runs by any Negro League player in history. But beyond just his power, Gibson was known for his defense as well, cutting down runners at a clip that kept the fastest runners in the Negro Leagues from testing his arm. Now, Gibson had a difficult life in a lot of different ways, and not just from being a black baseball player in the Jim Crow era. He lost his wife, who was giving birth to twins, when Gibson was only 19 years old and just starting his professional baseball career. He constantly battled against an addiction with alcohol, and his last year that he played was 1946, at the age of 34. He died from a stroke associated with having a brain tumor about 1 month after his 35th birthday in early 1947, only 3 months before being able to see Jackie Robinson break the color barrier in baseball. One of my favorite quotes about Josh Gibson is from Satchel Page himself. Page once said when describing Josh Gibson at the plate, "You look for his weakness, and while you're looking for it, he's liable to hit 45 home runs off you." And the number 1 player in Negro League history, at least in my mind, is Oscar Charleston. Oscar Charleston was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1896. He lied about his age in order to enlist into the military at the age of 15, and he was stationed in the Philippines for several years, where he actually learned to play baseball. When he returned as a 19-year-old, he became the starting center fielder for the Indianapolis APCs in 1915. He played for several years before the formation of the Negro Leagues in 1920. And after that, he played for several of the powerhouse teams in the league, including player-manager for the Pittsburgh Crawfords in 1932, which boasted one of the best rosters in history, including Josh Gibson, Satchel Page, Cool Papa Bell, and Judy Johnson as its stars. And all the while, Oscar Charleston continued to hit well over 300 all the way into his late 30s. Charleston was one of the most renowned players of his time. He had tremendous power. He could hit for average, he could run the bases, and he could play center field with the best of them. He was known for his talents on every single side of the ball, and there's nothing that he couldn't do well. He had a 43-year career as a player and then manager in the pre-Negro Leagues and Negro Leagues. His official career average was .365, and not only batting average, he consistently finished the seasons as one of the league leaders in stolen bases and home runs as well. He is credited with winning 3 different Triple Crowns, and he's often considered to have the second most home runs in the history of the Negro Leagues, behind Josh Gibson. Charleston was also known for his combative nature, especially early on in his playing career. He got into many brawls, including when he was arrested after running all the way in from center field to punch out an umpire who he thought was making bad calls against his team. He's among the top 5 Negro League hitters in history in batting average, home runs, and the number 1 all-time in stolen bases. Charleston spent much of the early 40s scouting the Negro Leagues on behalf of Branch Rickey, looking for the right player to cross over into Major League Baseball. Oscar Charleston continued to manage in the Negro Leagues all the way until it disbanded at the very end, leading the Indianapolis Clowns to a league championship in 1954. In October of 1954, he fell ill, either as a result of a heart attack or a stroke, we're not quite sure, but he passed away later that same month at the age of 57. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1976. Summing up my favorite quotes about these Negro League players, how could I pick anybody except Buck O'Neil, who was a quote-making machine? Of Oscar Charleston, O'Neil said, "Charlie was a tremendous left-handed hitter who could also bunt, steal 100 bases a year, and cover center field as well as anyone before him or since. He He was like Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, and Tris Speaker rolled all into one. So that's my top 10. If you liked it, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment if you have anything you want to say, or somebody that you think I left out. I'd love to hear about your opinions. And if you ever find yourself in Kansas City, be sure to get out there and check out the Negro League Museum. It is a wonderful place, rich in history, and could really use the support to be able to continue to tell the game of black baseball in the first half of the 20th century. Until next time, take care, keep talking baseball, and we'll see you around.